John Selden was an English jurist and a scholar of England's ancient laws and constitution, and scholar of Jewish law. He was known as a polymath, showing true intellectual depth and breadth. John Milton hailed Selden in 1644 as the chief of learned men reputed in this land. Early life. He was born at Salvington, in the parish of West Tarring, West Sussex, and was baptised at St Andrew's, the parish church. The cottage in which he was born survived until 1959, when it was destroyed by a fire caused by an electrical fault. His father, another John Selden, had a small farm. It is said that his skill as a violin player was what attracted his wife Margaret, who was from a better family. Being the only child of Thomas Baker of Rustington and descended from a knightly family of Kent, Selden was educated at the Free Grammar School at Chichester, the Prebendal School, and in 1600 he went on to Hart Hall, Oxford. In 1603 he was admitted to Clifford's Inn, London. In 1604 he moved to the Inner Temple, and in 1612 he was called to the bar. His earliest patron was Sir Robert Bruce Cotton, the antiquary, who seems to have employed him to copy and summarize some of the parliamentary records then held at the Tower of London. For some reason, Selden very rarely practiced in court, but his practice in chambers as a conveyancer and consulting counsel was large and apparently lucrative. Legal scholar into politics. In 1618, his History of Tithes appeared, although it had passed censorship and licensing. This dissertation on the historical basis of the tithe system caused anxiety among the bishops and provoked the intervention of the king. The author was summoned before the Privy Council and was compelled to retract his opinions. Also, his work was suppressed, and he was forbidden to reply to anyone who might come forward to answer it. This all seems to have caused Selden's entry into politics. Although he was not in the Parliament of England, he was the instigator and perhaps the draftsman of the protestation of 1621 on the rights and privileges of the House, affirmed by the House of Commons on the 18th of December 1621. He and several others were imprisoned, at first in the Tower and later under the charge of Sir Robert Ducie, Sheriff of London. During his brief detention, he occupied himself in preparing an edition of medieval historian Eadmer's history from a manuscript lent to him by his host a jailer, which he published 2 years afterwards. Parliamentarian. In 1623 he was returned to the House of Commons for the borough of Lancaster, and sat with John Coke, William Noy and John Pym on Sergeant Glanville's election committee. He was also nominated Reader of Leon's Inn, an office he declined to undertake. For this the benches of the Inner Temple fined him £20 and disqualified him from being one of the number. Nevertheless, after a few years, he became a master of the bench. In the first Parliament of Charles I, it appears from the Returns of Members, printed in 1878, that contrary to the assertion of all his biographers, he had no seat. In Charles's second Parliament, he was elected for Great Bedwin in Wiltshire, and took a prominent part in the impeachment of George Villiers, 1st Duke of Buckingham. In the following year, in Darnell's case, he was counsel for Sir Edmund Hampden in the Court of King's Bench. In 1628 he was returned to the Third Parliament of Charles for Lodgers Hall, Wiltshire, and was involved in drawing up and carrying the Petition of Right. In the session of 1629 he was one of the members responsible for the tumultuous passage in the House of Commons of the resolution against the illegal levy of tonnage and poundage, and, along with Sir John Eliot, Denzil Hollis, Long Valentine, William Strode, and the rest, he was sent back to the Tower. There he remained for 8 months, deprived for a part of the time of the use of books and writing materials. He was then removed, under less rigorous conditions, to the Marshalsea, until Archbishop Laud arranged for him to be freed. Some years before he had been appointed steward to the Earl of Kent, to whose seat rest in Bedfordshire he now retired. He was not elected to the short Parliament of 1640, but to the long Parliament summoned in the autumn. He was returned without opposition for Oxford University. He opposed the resolution against episcopacy which led to the exclusion of the bishops from the House of Lords, and printed an answer to the arguments used by Sir Harbottle Grimston on that occasion. He joined in the protestation of the Commons for the maintenance of the Protestant religion according to the doctrines of the Church of England, the authority of the Crown, and the liberty of the subject. He was equally opposed to the Court on the question of the commissions of lieutenancy of array and to the Parliament on the question of the militia ordinance. In the end, he supported Parliament against King Charles, because, according to him, Charles was certainly acting illegally, but Selden was not certain if Parliament was doing the same. In 1643, he participated in the discussions of the Westminster Assembly, where his Erastian views were opposed by George Gillespie. Selden's allies included Thomas Coleman, John Lightfoot, and Bulstrode Whitelocke. He was appointed shortly afterwards Keeper of the Rolls and Records in the Tower. In 1645 he was named one of the Parliamentary Commissioners of the Admiralty and was elected Master of Trinity Hall, Cambridge, an office that he declined to accept. In 1646, he subscribed the Solemn League and Covenant and, in 1647, was voted £5,000 by the Parliament as compensation for his pains under the monarchy. Last years, after the death of the Earl of Kent in 1639, Selden lived permanently under the same roof with the Earl's widow, the former Elizabeth Talbot. It is believed that he married her, although the marriage does not seem to have ever been publicly acknowledged. He assembled a famous library which eventually became part of the Bodleian Library's collection in 1659. In addition to a wide range of Greek, Arabic, Hebrew and Latin works, it included the Codex Mendoza and the Selden map of China. He died at Friary House in Whitefriars on 30th of November 1654, and was buried in the Temple Church, London. His tomb is today clearly visible through glass plates in the floor of this church. Furthermore, he is commemorated by a monumental inscription on the south side of the Temple Church. More than 2 centuries after his death, in 1880, a brass tablet was erected to his memory by the benches of the inner temple in the parish church of St Andrews, West Tarring. Works. It was as a prolific scholar and writer that Selden won his reputation. The early books were on English history and antiquities. In 1610 3 of his works came out, Iani Anglorum Facies Altera and England's Eponymus, which dealt with the progress of English law down to Henry II, and the Duello, or Single Combat, in which he traced the history of trial by battle in England from the Norman conquest. In 1613 he supplied a series of notes, including quotations and references to the first 18 cantos of Michael Drayton's Polyolbion. In 1614 he published Titles of Honour, which, in spite of defects and omissions, remained a comprehensive work for centuries. It was republished in a larger and greatly revised edition in 1631 and earned for Selden the praised monarch of letters from his friend Ben Jonson. In 1615, the Analecton Anglo-Britannicon, an account of the the civil administration of England before the Norman Conquest, written in 1607, was published. Its title and argument imitated the Franco-Gallia of François Hockman. In 1616 appeared notes on John Fortescue's De Laudibus Legum Anglia and Ralph de Hengram's Summa Magna e Parva. In 1618 his controversial History of Tithes was published. A first sign of the coming storm was the 1619 book controverting Selden, Sacrilege, sacredly handled in 2 parts, with an appendix, answering some objections by James Semple. Selden hit back, but was soon gagged. The churchmen Richard Tillersley and Richard Montague attacked the work. There were further replies by William Sclater and by Stephen Nettles. In it Selden tried to demonstrate that tithing depended on the civil law, rather than canon law. He also made much of the complexities of the ancient Jewish customs on tithes. The work was also a milestone in the history of English historical writing through its mixture of antiquarian philological scholarship with historical narrative, two approaches to the study of the past previously seen as distinct. In 1623 he produced an edition of Edma's Historia Novarum. It was notable for including in appendices information from the Doomsday Book, which at the time had not been published and could only be consulted in the original at Westminster on the payment of a fee. He published in 1642 Privileges of the Baronage of England when they sit in Parliament and discourse concerning the rights and privileges of the subject. In 1652 he wrote a preface and collated some of the manuscripts for Sir Roger Twaysden's Historia Anglici Scriptores Decem, Literature and Archaeology of the Near East. In 1617 his De Diis Syrais was issued, and immediately established him fame as an Orientalist. It is remarkable for its early use of the comparative method on Semitic mythology. Also, in 1642 he published a part of the Arabic Chronicle of Patriarch Eutychius of Alexandria, under the title Eutychi Egypti, Patriarchi Orthodoxorum Alexandrini, Ecclesiae Uae Origines. This mattered for the discussion in it of the absence in Alexandria of the distinction between priests and bishops, a burning issue in the debate at the time in the Church of England. In 1628, at the suggestion of Sir Robert Cotton, Selden compiled, with the assistance of 2 other scholars, Patrick Young and Richard James, a catalogue of the Arundel marbles. Studies on Judaism. He employed his leisure at rest in writing De Successionibus in bona defuncti secundum leges Ebriorum and De Successione in Pontificatum Ebriorum, published in 1631. During the progress of the constitutional conflict, he was absorbed in research, publishing De Jure Naturali Agentium Juxta Disciplinum Ebriorum in 1640. It was a contribution to the theorizing of the period on natural law. In the words of John Milton, this volume of natural and national laws proves, not only by great authorities brought together, but by exquisite reasons and theorems almost mathematically demonstrative, that all opinions, errors, known, read, and collated, are of main service and assistance toward the speedy attainment of what is truest. Quote, it develops into a theory of international law, taking as its basis the 7 laws of Noah. In 1644, he published Dissertatio de Reno Civili e Calendario Republici Judaicae. In 1646 his treatise on marriage and divorce among the Jews entitled Uxor Hebraica, and in 1647 the earliest printed edition of the Old English law book Fleta. In 1650 Selden began to print the trilogy he planned on the Sanhedrin. Is the first part of De Synodris e Praefecturis Juridis Veterum Ebriorum through the press, the second and third parts being severally published in 1653 and 1655. The aim of this work was to counter the use of the Presbyterians, in particular, made of arguments and precedents drawn from Jewish tradition. It was a very detailed study aimed at refuting such arguments, and pointing out the inherent flexibility of the actual tradition that was being cited. International law. He seems to have inclined towards the court rather than the popular party in the early 1630s, and even to have secured the personal favor of the king. To him in 1635 he dedicated his Mare Clausum, and under the royal patronage it was put forth as a kind of state paper. It had been written 16 or 17 years before, but James I had prohibited its publication for political reasons. Hence it appeared a quarter of a century after Grotius's The Free Sea, to which it was intended to be a rejoinder, and the pretensions advanced in which on behalf of the Dutch fishermen to poach in the waters off the English coasts. It was its purpose to explode the fact that Selden was not retained in the great case of ship money in 1637 by John Hampden, the cousin of his former client, may be accepted as additional evidence that his zeal in the popular cause was not so warm and unsuspected as it had once been. His last publication was a vindication of himself from certain charges advanced against him in his Mare Clausum around 1653 by Theodore Graswinckel, a Dutch jurist. Posthumous Publications. Several of Selden's minor works were printed for the first time after his death, including a tract in defense of the December 25th birth of Christ written during the Puritan Commonwealth when celebration of Christmas was prohibited. A collective edition of his writings was published by David Wilkins in 3 volumes folio in 1725, and again in 1726. Table Talk, for which he is perhaps best known, did not appear until 1689. It was edited by his amanuensis, Richard Millward, who affirms that the sense and notion is wholly Selden's, and that most of the words are his also. Its genuineness has sometimes been questioned. Views. Selden arrived at an Erastian position in church politics. He also believed in free will, which was inconsistent with Calvinism. He was skeptical of the legend of King Arthur as it had grown up, but believed Arthur had existed. The Druids, he suggested in comments on Polyolbion, were ancient and presumed esoteric thinkers. The popular image of a Druid descends via a mask of Inigo Jones from a reconstruction by Selden, based on ancient German statuary. Influence. According to the Encyclopedia of Historians and Historical Writing, he played a role of fundamental importance in the transition of English historical writing from a medieval antiquarianism to a more modern understanding of the scope and function of history than had ever before been expressed in Renaissance England. His reputation lasted well, with Mark Pattison calling him the most learned man, not only of his party, but of Englishmen. By about 1640, Selden's views had a large impact on the great circle around Lucius Carey, 2nd Viscount Falkland, William Chillingworth, Dudley Diggers, Henry Hammond. It was in this milieu that Selden met and befriended Thomas Hobbes. They had much in common in political thought, but the precise connections have not been clarified. Richard Cumberland followed Selden over both Grotius and Hobbes on natural law. Selden contested the scholastic position, after Cicero, that right reason could by its dictates alone generate obligation, by claiming that a formal obligation required a superior in authority. In his De Legibus, Cumberland rejects Selden's solution by means of the no-hide laws, in de jure naturally, in favor of Selden's less developed alternate solution. The latter is more orthodox for a Thomist and intellect practice agens as a natural faculty in the rational soul, by the mediation of which divine intellect can intervene directly with individuals. Matthew Hale tried to merge the theory of Grotius on property with Selden's view on obligation. Cumberland and Hale both belonged to a larger group of followers in a broad sense of Selden, with backgrounds mostly of Cambridge and the law, comprising also Orlando Bridgman, Hezekiah Burton, John Hollings, Richard Kidder, Edward Stillingfleet, John Tillotson, and John Wilkins. Giambattista Vico called Grotius, Selden and Samuel Puffendorf the three princes of the natural right of the gents. He went on to criticize their approach foundationally. In his autobiography he specifies that they had conflated the natural law of the nations based on custom with that of the philosophers, based on human abstractions. Isaiah Berling comments on Vico's admiration for Grotius and Selden.